know you. You're that
jaywalking public anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at 1984 by George Orwell, PragerU's recent video about it, and authoritarianism. Now, if you're not up to date on 1984 for whatever reason, there is an audiobook of it here, and a summary of it here. Links in the description, if you need to refresh yourself and come back. Okay, welcome back. Now, 1984 was written in 1948. World War II had just ended, and there was a lot of parallels between Nazi Germany and 1984. Suppression of music, jazz and swing records were destroyed in Nazi Germany. Suppression of literature, books were burned. War propaganda, radio programs in Nazi Germany lied about how the war was going. Spies turning people over to the Brotherhood is like people ratting out their neighbors for being Jewish. The Hate Week and demonizing Goldstein is literally the Jewish question conspiracy theory. And the rationing, torture, and perpetual war economy and all of that are heavily present in Nazi Germany and 1984. Now, some of you may have seen that PragerU has a book club. And I think that's great. I'm happy to see conservatives reading. But this club has some issues. They recently did a video discussing 1984, and it ain't great, folks. If you haven't seen it, feel free to go and check it out and come back again. Link in the description. Sorry for sending you off so much to go do homework. It's like being back in high school, where you probably read 1984 for the first time. Anyway, from this point forward, I'd like to do two things. First, look at what PragerU considered signs of 1984-style authoritarianism in our modern day. And secondly, what I think are signs of 1984-style authoritarianism in our modern day. Now, a lot of PragerU, Dave, Rubin, and the other guys' interpretation actually doesn't have anything to do with authoritarian structures at all. They mention Black Lives Matter and Twitter and vaguely left politics in general.
The three slogans of the party that you've always got to repeat, they've got it on the back of the book right here. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. This could be the chants of protesters that we see marching all around the West.
This ultra-lefty progressive thing will come in through the soft spot of liberalism, the openness of liberalism, and dismantle every statue, destroy every university, crush every newspaper. I mean, everything.
All the great achievements of liberalism.
And that's exactly what this book is about.
You have to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, because if we all really believe that, then that will be true. And it seems to be the same thing when you call a he, when you call him her, you have really substantively changed who he is.
In the midst of, you know, what's happening with Black Lives Matter and everything else, and it's like, no, it's all the left.
It's this America.
It's this America. It's not
ring,
Trump that's doing this. It's the other guys that are doing this.
History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right.
Sounds like life on Twitter.
But this isn't authoritarianism. Mr. Rube and the other guy use examples of tearing down statues and using trans pronouns as similar to the way that the Ministry of Truth destroys history and limits language. But come on, think about it for even just a second. Which one of these is an authoritarian rewriting of history or limiting of language? The state glorifying slave-owning traders, or destroying these false representations of our history in support of a more honest understanding of our past? How about having a rigid false dichotomy of gender according to tradition, or expanding our understanding of gender in response to a more nuanced biological and sociological understanding? These things aren't 1984. They're not even authoritarian. Ruby and the other guy have it totally twisted. Watching them call Black Lives Matter and Antifa authoritarian is hilarious. Like, who's the president of BLM? Who is the supreme chancellor of Antifa? There are no leaders, no council or vanguard. These groups are specifically and intentionally non-hierarchical. There is no authority. Authoritarianism is by definition a form of government characterized by strong central power and limited political freedoms. Basically, authoritarianism is when a small group or even individual leader at the top tightly controls how you act and what you're allowed to do. Authoritarianism doesn't really exist in our social lives, outside of, say, interactions with the police or something. No, in our free time, no one is stopping you from having a diary. No one is stopping you from watching Netflix all day. You can freely listen to Bucket of Piss if you so choose. You can watch this YouTube video. And within TOS, I'm basically free to make the video however I want. Watch, I'll prove it. For the rest of the video, I'm going to be totally silent. Okay, no, just kidding. Don't click away, I have other stuff to say. If you want to look at a novel more relevant to our social lives, look at something like Brave New World, where the characters are stuck in unfulfilling jobs and are drugged and entertained to keep them complacent. Just like how we all take medication or self-medicate to find complacency in our monotonous lives. Or what about Infinite Jest, where the idea of endlessly channel surfing is exaggerated to such a degree that the book practically predicted the way we mindlessly scroll through timelines on our cell phones. Or for a more Marxist view, check out the dispossessed... damn it, I mentioned Daddy Marx. Now I've totally lost any PragerU fans who are watching. Anyway, our social lives, our free time isn't authoritarian. School, prison, work, these are authoritarian institutions, with a principal or a warden or a boss being the authority figure. Our lives outside of these institutions doesn't really fit an authoritarian framework. I guess, short story long, I think it's hilarious to look at the world today and think that 1984 is represented in a bunch of everyday people tearing down monuments to racists and demanding improvements in state policing, and not in nameless federal soldiers abducting protesters in unmarked vans. The most hilarious part of the video is this, where Davey Ruby says,
I dare make a pro-Trump comment. I don't know if I'm allowed.
Will certainly be censored by the Ministry of Truth on the internet.
Somebody's not going to be happy about this. But in many ways, when I was rereading it, I kept thinking, man, what they needed was a Trump.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because what was Trump, or what is Trump? He just sort of broke through all of this. If you're talking about how do you break the duopoly, how do you break the false choices, how do you break political correctness, all of these things, who has been the greatest breaker of those things? It's been Trump.
Really? Trump? A symbol of standing against 1984? Of standing against false information and rewriting history and authoritarianism? Trump, the president of lying about your inauguration numbers? Of calling climate change a Chinese hoax? Of calling Mexicans rapists and murderers? Of calling your critics fake news? Of calling the coronavirus a democratic hoax? You want to see authoritarian doublespeak? Just take a look at the alternative facts president. But okay, I suppose we're getting into the next segment. What about today? Where is 1984 actually represented in our modern world? Well, do you want to see the equivalent of a telescreen watching your every move? How about this? Yeah, cameras, everywhere at every workplace. What about the Brotherhood looking out for rule breakers? Well, how about having a team leader or supervisor or assistant manager checking in on you constantly, making sure you aren't breaking any rules? Where do you see uniforms and suppression of your individuality? At work.
We are Walmart. Everybody, one more time. We are Walmart. Last time.
What about suppression and manipulation of language? Well, when I worked at a fast food place and they got a self-checkout kiosk, they put up a flyer in the break room warning that we were banned from speaking ill about the kiosk. At 2 jobs that I've had, they made a big deal about signing an agreement not to talk to the press. And don't even get me started about advocating to start a union. What about doublespeak? Well, you ever heard of a right to work state? Calling restrictions against workers a right? Have you been working during this pandemic? I know that my job euphemistically called hazard pay our appreciation pay. Oh, we don't need to start a union, we have an open door policy, and shit like that. But okay, This covers personal experiences with authoritarianism, but what about this second half of the book, that deals with imprisonment, torture, and brainwashing? Well, for more on this, I recommend my review of the shock doctrine, or the examples of US-sponsored torture I discussed in my video on US foreign policy in the rest of America. But for a brief look, let's compare two quotes. One from 1984, and one from the shock doctrine. 1984. This is O'Brien talking to Winston during the torture sequence at the end of the book. O'Brien states, "Obedience is not enough. Unless he is suffering, how can you be sure that he is obeying your will and not his own? Power is in inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing." The shock doctrine. This is a conversation between the author, Naomi Klein, and Gail Castor, a victim of CIA-funded interrogation experiments. Klein states, "I recently traveled to Iraq, and I am trying to understand the role torture is playing there. We are told it's about getting information, but I think it's more than that. I think it may also have to do with trying to build a model country, about erasing people and then trying to remake them from scratch." There's a long pause, and then a different tone of voice to the reply. Still strained, but is it relief? "You have just spelled out exactly what the CIA and Ewan Cameron did to me. They tried to erase and remake me, but it didn't work." Lastly, let's look at the foreign policy stuff. Looking at the Nazi perpetual war economy and the US creation of the military-industrial complex that went from fighting alongside Russia in World War II to fighting against Russia in the Cold War, it makes sense for Orwell to take this concept and create the perpetual war and going back and forth from war with East Asia to war with Eurasia that takes place in 1984. Now, I could give an extensive history of proxy wars engaged in during the Cold War, and the way that the war on terror has become its replacement, but I'm going to wrap the perpetual war concept and the historical amnesia concept into one, and say, during the Cold War, the US funded religious extremism in the Middle East as part of their fight against atheistic communism in Russia. And this included overthrowing the democratically elected president of Iran and replacing him with a religious oligarch in the Shah in the 1950s, overthrowing the democratically elected president of Iraq and replacing him with Saddam in the late 50s, giving $3 billion in weapons and aid to the Mujahideen terrorists in Afghanistan to fight the Russians in the 70s and 80s, funding both sides of the Iraq and Iran war in the mid and late 80s, then invading Iraq in the 90s, and then invading Afghanistan in 2001, and invading Iraq again in 2003, and however many Middle Eastern countries the US is bombing at this time. Over 60 years of US intervention in the Middle East. Or as this meme so brilliantly puts it, when you fund a terrorist group, to get rid of the terrorist group you funded, to get rid of the terrorist group you funded, to get rid of the terrorist group you funded, to get rid of the terrorist group you funded, to get rid of the terrorist group. And yet, I wonder how many American citizens think that US foreign policy in the Middle East started with September 11th. That sure sounds like authoritarian perpetual war and rewriting of history to me. So, anyway, that about settles it. No. The socialist author George Orwell would not see Black Lives Matter, using preferred pronouns, tearing down Confederate statues, or Antifa as authoritarianism. George Orwell would say that the president lying about global warming, trying to use libel laws to sue journalists, trying to remove people's citizenship for burning the flag, lying about a global pandemic, and sending nameless soldiers to abduct protesters in unmarked vans, that is the boot stomping on the face. That is authoritarianism. Anyway, as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance, to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support, and avoid my own dystopian nightmares. And I think that that's really awesome, and I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what you see here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
Somebody told me that I was watching you. Somebody else said you know it's not true. Who do you believe? Enough!
eyes and look at the big picture. You're all puppets of corrupt politicians and capitalists.